All right, I'm back. Sorry about that. Um, had a little, had a phone call. um, okay, so we were fascism. Not all governments were universally hostile to the Soviet approach. Lenin, Mussolini echoed Lenin's approach in nationalizing film, but Lenin took a very hands off. I'm sorry, Mussolini took a hands off approach. So in Germany, at the beginning of the 1930s, Germany enjoyed a dominant position in European cinema. It also had a vital left wing culture. It can be argued that the biggest effect that Nazism and other fascism had on cinema did not lie in the films that were produced in Germany and other countries so much in the immigration they produced in 1933 and then again in 1940. So what happens as Nazism starts to take over, you have people emigrating out of Germany to get out of this heavy-handed control of Germany. And so you had this immigration of filmmakers who were leaving. The rise of fascism and the exaggerated nationalism. I'm sorry, I'm back on page 337. The rise of fascism and the exaggerated nationalism of the 1930s also had economic effects on cinema. In the 1930s, the 1920s, a number of European countries had acted somewhat blatantly to stem the tide of Hollywood imports through some form of protection legislation. They also began to forge economic links among themselves, leading in the early sound period to the making of a number of multilingual productions in which the same script was shot on the same set, often with the same director, but with different actors for different language versions. So they were shooting these multilingual films. They would take a film and they would shoot it one way with a set of actors, and then use the same sets, the same script, change the language, and then shoot it again in a different language. They called it multilinguals. In 1938, Italy, rather bludgeonry, followed suit. A proposal to nationalize the distribution companies responsible for importing films provoked the withdrawal of Hollywood majors from the Italian market. And with the outbreak of war, all importing of American films came to end. Meanwhile, a major ideological shift was taking place in Europe, which affected both politics and culture, the relationship between them. The 1920s, the Jazz Age, had been a period of optimism and of a widespread political indifference, but also of extremism of various kinds in both politics and art. Modernistic experiment flourished, and realism was out of flavor. A number of avant-garde artists attached themselves to the far left and far right political movements. The Italian futurists to fascism, the Russian futurists and constructivists to the revolution, Dada and surrealism to communism and Trotskyism. So what's happening is you have artists in various movements attaching of various styles attaching themselves to different political movements now and ideological movements. In the 1930s, a dramatic change came about. An immediate cause was the Depression, and also the New York Stock Exchange, the crash of the market in 1929. So, the more significance in this effect was the realignment of the left in response to the rise of fascism and the consequent formation of the Popular Fronts. In the late 1920s, the international communist movement under Soviet leadership had adopted a hostile position towards the rest of the left, but in 1934, it had begun to repair the breach. There were not only communist parties encouraging to seek alliance with socialists and other left-wing parties, but communist artists and intellectuals were persuaded to take up a more conciliatory attitude towards the bourgeois counterparts. Frenchism offered a formal link between political commitment and a realistic aesthetic at a time when the avant-garde was in crisis and many artists were in a headlong retreat from their previous radical positions. It had an additional appeal in cinema, where the triumph of the synchronized dialogue film had undermined the presuppositions of the silent aesthetic. On page 340, so we're moving forward to the Second World War. The Second World War in Europe in September 1939. In cinematic terms, it's the first immediate effect in Britain. Was the government briefly closed all cinemas and was only reluctantly persuaded to reopen them. Its next effect was that as the German Blitzkrieg progressed, Hollywood lost its lucrative export markets in Europe. National cinemas throve, though in the occupied countries they were subject to strict German censorship and control. So with the Second World War, America lost its European market, and they can no longer export to these places. It was very lucrative. In combatant countries, the situation was different. Both Germany and Britain rapidly put their film industries on a war footing, followed in 1941 by the Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent the United States. Documentary and newsreel acquired a new importance and in some cases popularity. So these documentary and newsreel films is their way of getting information out about the war efforts. And so the nations or the governments take on an increased interest in them. More interesting was the effect on featured films. Unlike the First World War, the emphasis in most of the combatant countries was much less of whipping up hatred against the enemy and far more on creating a sense of national unity and solidarity in the face of an external threat. Okay, next section is national cinemas. The popular art of French cinema. As in Hollywood, the period of 1930 and 1960 constitutes the classical era of French cinema, a period of well-defined genres and industrial structures, and a time when cinema was the main form of popular entertainment. During these years, many of the great classics of French cinema were produced. At the same time, it was a period marked by recurrent crisis in the film industry, serious political unrest, a world war. If the era opened on the sound revolution, heralding a new film language and the increased popularity of the medium, it ended more ambiguously in the 1950s, as the 1950s saw both the exhilarating emergence of the New Wave. The New Wave was a cinematic style, so to speak, in French cinema. So it saw this new wave and beginning in a decline in cinema attendance. The coming of sound took the French industry by surprise. It was artistically rich in the 1920s. Hollywood was the dominant production and had dropped 55 films in 1926. The French scientists had invented sound systems as early as 1900, but none had been patented. So American and German systems had to be imported for them to have films with sound. French filmmakers quickly adapted to the talkies of the 1930s, and they saw a rapid increase in the number of features produced, shooting up to 157 of them in 1931. The coming of sound put an end to the avant-garde, but the silent film directors, they made this transition and became prominent directors in the 1930s and beyond. So the directors and the silent film directors were able to make that transition to sound and become prominent directors. In the 1930s, the success of sound and the popularity of it made the rise of two new genres, the musical and filmed theater. The musical took the French by storm. Cheaply made stories built around music hall comic singers, especially George Milton. A very idiosyncratic subset of this genre was the military vaudeville. That's in French cinema. Their delight in the French language, shared by the audience, strongly contributed to a specifically French cinema. In the face of the Hollywood threat, it was also heralded the unique place of scriptwriters in French cinema. Playwrights like Marcel Archard and poets like Jacques Prévert wrote for the screen, and a new generation of scriptwriters emerged. That was coming out of French cinema. So now we're going to talk about occupation and liberation. France under occupation, the German Nazi occupation and liberation. Marshal Pétain's capitulation, the German occupation of France, and the division of the country into a free zone in the south and an occupied one all had profound effects on French cinema. Some filmmakers and actors immigrated to the USA, while others had to go into hiding because of anti-Semitic laws. The majority remained in France, and they worked relatively smoothly under the new regime. In an endeavor to limit the Nazi Germany control over French cinema, the French film industry created a ruling body, the Committee of the Organization of Cinematic Industries. It was based in Paris, and they introduced new film regulations, some are still being used to this day. The dominant production of the time, during these weird years of being occupied by Nazis, was considered escapist, and they were American comedies, and thrillers, and musicals. So they were really making films for their audience to escape the perils of the reality of what was going on. French film industry soon faced a number of problems, in particular the reappearance of the American films on the French market. And to make matters worse, the Blum-Burroughs trade agreement of 1946, as part of the settlement of the French War to the USA, granted generous import quotas to American films in exchange for U.S. imports for French luxury goods. In the end, though, the balance of the French versus American films was not very different from its pre-war level and roughly suited to the production capacities. French film production, in fact, went back to its 100 to 120 film yearly average in the early 50s. All right. One more point. The late 1950s saw the end of the retrograde Fourth Republic and the new era of General de Gaulle's Fifth Republic, heralding the true modern France. To this political and economic sea change corresponded the filmic upheaval of the New Wave. The polemical style of its practitioners called for a tabula rasa of French cinema, dismissing in its wake most of the previous 20 years as stilted and formulaic, and French film as inferior to Hollywood, with one or two exceptions such as Jean Reno. All right, I'm going to stop there. And there we have it. See you on the next one.